Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for the warm welcome. This is actually my fourth time in Camden. So I'm basically one of you now, and I'm just thankful this time you didn't send me in one of those little planes up from Portland. But it's kind of funny, because I was finishing off this talk this morning, looking out from the Camden Harbour Inn, and again, as usual, every time I come, there's piles of snow everywhere, and I'm getting my jacket on, I'm getting ready, and I thought to myself, this is my fourth time, when are they going to invite me out in the summer? Is that ever going to happen? Can somebody make that happen, please? But we had a lovely dinner on Thursday evening, where one of your colleagues was very direct. He said, look, Matt, we've brought you here to be honest, to keep us in touch with reality, to challenge some of our ideological priors when it comes to populism. And I said, look, I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and help keep everybody honest, because the truth is, since I first came to Camden in 2018, I've been on quite a journey. Back then, I was a university professor. I was a real believer in the liberal consensus. I was horrified by the votes for Brexit in my country, the votes for Donald Trump here in the United States. But the truth of the matter is, over the last 6 or 7 years, I found my views changing in some profound ways. And I began to challenge, like millions of voters out there, I began to challenge the liberal consensus and really think about, actually, where's it all gone wrong? And that was especially visible to me in the universities, the sort of epicenter, if you like, of liberalism. And over the last few years, as David just mentioned, I found myself drifting away from my academic colleagues, and I began to write more in the national conversation, particularly in Europe. I started a Substack. In fact, the first ever Substack post I wrote was here in Camden, Maine. Was about 2 years ago. That blog, which really gives you the views of a disillusioned liberal, of a disillusioned citizen, is now the #1 blog in the UK. So if you'd like to join us, please do. But I warn you now, you will be triggered by what I write. Because look, I think the reality is, as I said for the first time here in 2018, I remember the talk very well, because I said national populism is here for good. It's not going to go away. And the reason I said that right here in this spot in 2018 is because if you look at all of the evidence that we have in social science as to what's going on within liberal democracies, it's very clear to me that actually this is a deep-rooted, permanent correction within our political systems. What we're living through, I argued in a book called National Populism, what we're living through is a political realignment. And David just gave us a wonderful lecture on the origins of democracy. And the truth of the matter is, we've only really had mass democracy for 100 years, in the sense of all adults being able to participate, not restricting the franchise. This is still actually a very young experiment in the history of human civilization. Yes, the roots go back to ancient Greece, but in reality, we've only had mass democracy with voting rights for everybody for about 100 years or so. And for much of that time, the principal dividing line was between left and right, and it wasn't only about economics, but it was predominantly about economics. If you believed in redistribution, you're on the left. If you felt that we should leave it more to the market, you're on the right. But what I've argued through all of my work is that increasingly from the 21st century onwards, we are now moving into a two-dimensional conflict in democracy, whereby cultural values, how we feel about our identities, our sense of belonging, our nationhood, that those cultural values are now becoming as important as those economic conflicts that characterized democracies during the 20th century. And I think if you look around Western democracies today, that is increasingly visible. I mean, it isn't just about the re-election of Donald Trump here in America. I remember in the Substack I caused enormous outrage among my liberal friends when I wrote the week after Kamala Harris was effectively appointed. I said Kamala Harris is going to be a disaster for the Democrats. And unfortunately, for lots of reasons, that turned out to be the case. But the reason I said that is if you looked at the data 6 months before the US election, it was very clear to me that Donald Trump was expanding the political realignment that I've written about for much of the last 10 years. That he was doing much better among Latino and Hispanic voters, he was doing a little bit better among African American voters, and he was really tapping into those working class non-graduate voters, especially outside of the cities. And the reason I was pretty confident in making that analysis is because of what I saw taking place in Europe. We've got an enormous election in Germany over the next 48 hours. But again, there you see the alternative for Germany doing strongest among men. It's the most popular party in Germany among men. Doing especially well among people who haven't gone to university, doing especially well among the working class, all groups that Russell Dalton, the political scientist, said were key to this permanent political realignment. That the new dividing lines, and David just alluded to this, but the new dividing lines in our politics are really primarily now about education, whether or not you belong to the graduate class or whether or not you're a non-graduate, and in turn, that education divide is anchoring that divide over cultural values. University graduates obviously being more liberal in their orientation, non-graduates being more culturally conservative in their orientation. In my country, the UK, now Nigel Farage, an ally of Donald Trump and the Reform Party, #1 in the national polls. In France, I think it's entirely plausible, David may agree with me, that Marine Le Pen will become the next president of France. And I suspect that what we're seeing in Austria, Sweden, and the Netherlands, where these parties are now winning elections, is again further evidence of this permanent realignment that we're living through in Western democracies. All of which raises the intriguing question of, okay, well, how might you think about responding to this if you are a disillusioned liberal, perhaps looking for something more than what the Financial Times and The Economist will tell you? Because I don't think this is just about political protest. I don't think this is just about racism. I don't think this is just about misinformation or disinformation. I think the reality, and I have made this argument for 10 years, and people do struggle with it, I think the reality is that millions of people out there actually have very good reasons to question and challenge the liberal consensus. I think if you look at all of the research that we've got on populism, and let's be clear what we mean by that word. I define national populism as a movement that prioritizes the culture and interests of the majority against what it argues is a corrupt, self-serving, and neglectful elite minority. That's how I would define national populism. And I think it's really doing so well at the moment and pushing through this realignment because it's anchored in 4 key drivers. I think the first, and again, David just alluded to this when he showed you that remarkable chart on the collapse of public trust. The first is widespread distrust, not just in our political institutions, but in all of the most important and influential institutions that govern our national life. Yes, voters are more distrustful than ever in our established politics, but they're also distrustful of legacy media. They're distrustful of cultural institutions. They're distrustful of the creative industries. In my country, they're increasingly distrustful of organizations like the BBC. And David said democracy ultimately is about people having power. But I would ask this question: how much power do people really have in contemporary liberal democracies? There's a very influential book in political science for me called Diploma Democracies, in which 2 political scientists pointed out that pretty much every institution in our national life is dominated by people who tend to come from the same backgrounds, who tend to share the same liberal values. They often belong to the graduate class, they've often gone through the most elite universities, they often tend to lean left on cultural issues, and yes, they lean to the center-left on economic issues, but they made the point in that book, looking at every Western democracy, that actually if you belong to the non-graduate majority, which is still the majority in most Western democracies, if you belong to the working class, you actually have very little power in most of the institutions that don't just determine the direction of our political lives, but determine the parameters of our national conversation, or what Jonathan Rauch once called the constitution of knowledge. So from the publishing industry to the media, to the museums and the galleries, the way in which we think about ourselves in Western democracies is principally framed around how a minority of citizens think about themselves. And understandably, I think that's left many people feeling as though they don't really have much of a voice in the institutions. I think, secondly, we have widespread feelings of relative deprivation out there in Western democracies. And by that, I don't just mean people falling into poverty. I mean, relative to others, how do I feel about my collective group? Do I feel as though my collective group has as much social status as other groups in society? At Harvard, Peter Hall did a fascinating study on the drivers of populism. And he looked at every Western democracy, and he found that actually it wasn't objective economic deprivation that was pushing people into these movements. Peter argued it was a subjective sense of relative deprivation. How do I feel my group is doing relative to other groups in society? And he pointed specifically to the white working class because he said that's the group that feels more than any other that it's been left behind by the liberal consensus. And the reality is, actually, that's right. If you look at the literature on globalization, I remember politicians like Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, saying that globalization would lift all boats, and that if we just ease some of the borders and we deregulated industry, that would be good for everybody. But we now know in economics that wasn't the case. We know that what I'd call hyper-globalization, the rampant opening of national economies, the loosening of national borders, had a disproportionately negative effect on white working class voters in industrial heartlands, not only here in America, but across Europe. And I would argue that's now being exacerbated by the embrace of net zero policies, whereby in my country, in the UK, we are actually closing steel factories across northern England and Wales while importing energy from Russia and China. And I don't think that is actually strengthening Western democracies at all. I think thirdly, we've got some very intense fears over the destruction of national ways of life. I think people have legitimate and understandable worries about the pace and the scale of demographic change in Western societies. Increasingly, particularly in European nations, what we're witnessing is what some social scientists have called a population trap, whereby the scale of demographic change exceeds the capacity of the state to provide basic public services. What do I mean by that? Take my country, the UK. If you look at what's going to happen to the UK between today and the year 2047, okay, which really isn't that far away, 22 years, my daughter is 3, okay, so when she turns 25, according to the government's own forecast, the UK will have another 10 million people coming into the country. 86% of all migration into the UK today comes from outside of Europe, okay, Nigeria, China, Pakistan, and so on. Within that context, how do you provide, as a state, a functioning national health service, a functioning housing sector? How can you keep people safe on the streets? How can you provide a sense of security and safety? And increasingly, what I suspect we'll see in Germany over the next 48 hours as well, are these concerns not just actually rooted in racism, but what I would argue are very legitimate concerns about the capacity of nation states to absorb a scale of change they've not experienced previously. Samuel Huntington, some of you will remember, in the aftermath of 9/11, wrote a book called Who Are We?, in which he argued that the biggest challenge facing Western democracies over the next 20 years was how they manage large-scale migration, which would undermine a sense of shared values. Robert Putnam at Harvard, about 10 years later, wrote a very controversial but important paper in which he looked at the effects of large-scale migration in Western democracies, and he warned that if they continued, they would enter a new era in which they would become low-trust societies where people would hunker down and turn away from one another and become less willing to contribute to welfare states. And I think unless we, again, as disillusioned liberals, of which I put myself in that camp, unless we actually step back and say, okay, how are we going to better manage the scale of demographic change while maintaining core public services, I think national populist parties will only continue to get stronger and stronger. And fourthly, lastly, we are now, as all political scientists would accept, we are now in a new era of what we'd call de-alignment, whereby the tribal loyalties and the allegiances that characterized the golden age of democracy in the post-war period, my father voted Labour, his father voted Labour, and his father voted Labour, that those tribal allegiances have now completely given way. And I'll give you one example again from Europe. If you look at the last 10 years, 60% of voters in Western democracies have changed their vote from one party to another. 60%. Now, that would never have been the case in the 1950s through to basically the 2000s, where you had those rigid tribal loyalties behind the established parties. So in this era of de-alignment, politics is much more volatile, it's much more chaotic, it's much more fluid, and the established parties are under pressure like never before, which is easing the rise of these new disruptors and these insurgents into Western politics, many of which are saying, look, the established parties have presided over this liberal consensus that has left you feeling left behind, not only feeling left behind economically, which is obviously critical, but feeling left behind culturally, as though there is an elite minority dominating the institutions that doesn't really care about your voice and your values. And many voters, I think, are rebelling against that. Now, in case you can't tell already, I like being quite provocative, okay? And I'm just going to add a fifth point here based on something that I wrote about yesterday, because I think this study is fascinating. We have talked a lot over the last 15 years about the dangers of right-wing populism. We've talked a lot about the dangers of Donald Trump. We've talked a lot about the dangers of Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, and other populists in Europe. We have not talked enough about what's happening on the left of politics. Now, there's a fascinating study that was just released by the think tank More in Common just a few days ago, and I wrote about it yesterday. And it's looked at what's happened to the cultural left in Western democracies. And More in Common is a very liberal centrist think tank. You certainly couldn't call it right-wing. And what they found is that many of the people on the cultural left, the liberal left, who tend to dominate many of the institutions, the universities, schools, creative industries, museums, galleries, and so on, found that while they share the economic views of the average voter, over the last 15 years, they have moved so far left on cultural issues that they are no longer remotely in touch with the vast majority of voters in their societies. And they looked at everything: attitudes towards immigration, attitudes towards refugees, attitudes towards issues like gender, sex, how we think about Western history. Are we positive about our history? Do we think that our history is a source of shame and embarrassment? And consistently on all of these measures, they found that liberal progressives were fundamentally at odds with the average voter. More worryingly than the cultural gap that has now emerged between those on the left and the average voter were their attitudes towards free speech. Because consistently, they found that people on the liberal progressive side are the most skeptical of free speech and free expression when they feel that it clashes with protecting minorities from emotional harm. This is a key point, that consistently, when people on the liberal left were presented with views that they felt might offend racial, sexual, and gender minorities, they were willing to sacrifice free speech on the altar of protecting those groups from offense, which is why they're more supportive of censorship, why they're more supportive of shutting down the public square, or at least narrowing the conversation about these issues. And we see this obviously reflected in debates over social media. We see it reflected in debates over so-called misinformation and disinformation. And why am I making this point? I'm making this point because I think voters from America to Europe can now sense what has happened to that group on the left. That on a whole array of issues, like advocating for more immigration, advocating for weaker borders, saying we should take more refugees, saying that actually children should be able to change their gender, or that perhaps there are dozens of different genders, perhaps saying that Western civilization and its history are a source of shame and embarrassment rather than a source of pride. Most average voters do not think that way. And where I see the Democrats and also the Labour Party in the UK and centre-left parties in Europe going wrong is that they are embracing that worldview to such an extent that they are simultaneously alienating the forgotten majority in Western democracies. And unless the left can come back to its senses on those cultural issues, which are not going to be going anywhere anytime soon, then national populists will continue to perform not just strongly at elections, but even more strongly than they did in the past. So that's how I see the future of Western democracies. I think there is an enormous opportunity for people who have experienced election defeats over the last 10 years to really reflect seriously on where things have gone wrong. It's not enough, I'm afraid, to blame Donald Trump and Elon Musk for what's happening. I think it is a time for liberals across the West to really do some soul-searching and to really look themselves in the mirror and think, are we really still in touch with the average voter in Western democracies? And can we really find our way back to a message and a campaign that can much better relate to the everyday concerns of ordinary people? Thank you very much.